Good morning, everyone. This is where you say good morning back. Let's try that again. Good morning, everyone. Excellent. My teacher skills have not gone away. My name's Dave Davis, and I'm going to just use a pretentious word. I'm the founder of JoCo Con. Years and years ago in a previous century, Johnson County Community College had a speculative fiction convention called FoolCon. And when the individuals responsible for that retired, they took all their material, dumped it in my office, and said, bring it back. I refused to call it FoolCon, so we came up with the incredibly clever JoCo Con, and also broadened the concept. So we have had a tried and true convention, vendors, people in costume, breakout sessions, but we've also done speaker series, which is what you're here for today. So welcome to this year's manifestation of JoCo Con, and I'm going to introduce Danny Alexander, who will then introduce our speaker, who you actually came to hear. Thanks.
And I promise to keep it mercifully brief. So, yes, I'm Danny Alexander. I've been here since the school was built. So I'm here to speak as briefly as possible while honoring how lucky we all are to be able to spend the next hour with Andrea Stewart. This is her official bio. Andrea Stewart, embarrass you here, is the daughter of immigrants and was raised in a number of places across the United States. Stewart is a Sunday Times best-selling author whose short stories can be found in such venues as Beneath Ceaseless Skies, Daily Science Fiction, Galaxy's Edge, and others. Her debut epic fantasy novel, The Bone Shard Daughter, was a finalist for the Locus Award for Best First Novel, the British Fantasy Award for Best Novel, the Goodreads Choice Award for Fantasy and Debut Novel, and the Book Nest Award for Best Traditionally Published Novel. She now lives in sunny California, and in addition to writing, can be found herding cats and 2 small children.
Yes.
Yes. In what may feel like another life, now that Andrea's moved on to publish 6 critically acclaimed, and I can't overstate that. I mean, if you just read the raves on these books, the finest writers in her genre are singing her praises, right? And best-selling novels in the past 6 years. She began in the COVID era, and she has 6 novels since then. So Stewart studied economics at the University Davis. And it's evident that she's putting that work and her life experience to use in The Bone Shard Daughter and the whole series that kicks off The Drowning Empire. That series begins with characters discovering who they are in a world run by an elite few who use magical forces that create life while robbing common people of their ability to work. Seems familiar.
Yeah.
Her second trilogy, The Gods Below, is set in a post-apocalyptic world of environmental devastation. Though the ideas themselves give these books great nuanced depth, none of that would matter so much if Stewart didn't create such well-rounded, believable characters. Readers eagerly follow these characters as fast as they can turn the pages, myself included. I can say many write their entire lives, counting me, dreaming of the kind of economy of style and power of story that propels Stewart's work. Join me in giving her a warm welcome as she shares with us her perspective on a subject she knows well, rebellion in fiction.
Hi, everybody. I'm very excited to come and give this talk. I have done a dry run in front of my sister and her baby seemed to enjoy it quite a lot, so here goes. All right, so rebellion can be used quite broadly and not just in a governmental sense. So I just wanted to go over the Merriam-Webster definition of rebellion. So it is defined as opposition to one in authority or dominance. So on a smaller level, we see children engage in rebellion against their parents, often teenagers, as they find their own identities separate from their parents. You can be rebelling against rules. I personally have a catio that the HOA has told me to take down, but I refuse to. You can rebel against the workplace. As we see right now, there are a lot of people that are refusing to go back to the office full time. And you can rebel against social norms. So we see sometimes people will refuse to buy a diamond ring when they get engaged or to host an expensive wedding. So these are all rebellions, and they are all still topics often explored in fiction. But in this presentation, I'm going to talk about rebellion in a larger sense. So when we think about it in a larger sense, we see rebellion used, we see revolution used, we see civil war used. So when we talk about revolution, that's a forcible overthrowing of the government or social order in favor of a new system. And a civil war is a violent conflict within the same country, fought between organized groups of its own citizens, often over control of the government, territory, or major policy differences. So if you think about this, there is some overlap here. You can have a rebellion within a revolution. You can have it in a civil war sense. So these are all kind of interrelated. Okay, so I do want to talk about the varied depictions and the audiences they reach when we talk about rebellion. So the first one is probably very familiar to all of you. It's from A New Hope. This is the medal ceremony they have after blowing up the Death Star. The second one, it may look at first glance like a still from Les Mis, but it's actually from Andor, which is a television show in Star Wars in the exact same universe. So these are actually very different depictions of the exact same rebellion, which I find so interesting. So when you look at different depictions, a lot of times we'll be thinking about the audience. So the audience here can be very different. Like a 10-year-old may watch A New Hope and just love it, but I feel like if they watched Andor, they would probably struggle with it. So between the two, a more simplistic rendition or a more complicated one, is there a right way to depict rebellion? I would say no. I feel like there are valid reasons to write a more simplified rebellion over a more complicated and messy one. Between these two examples, I feel like there's a very good reason that you don't see the Force very often used in Andor, because I feel like it would take away from the messages that they're trying to convey. Whereas it's a focus of A New Hope, like Luke is learning how to use the Force and a lightsaber. It's a classic feel-good narrative of a farm boy becoming a hero. While Andor is a complex breakdown of the sacrifice necessary to make a rebellion work. So these are two fundamentally different stories. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on the complexity of rebellion because I feel like more people are familiar with the more straightforward take. But when you are writing rebellion, consider who the audience is, but also think about what should be in the foreground of your story and what is in the background and what you're focusing on and why. And that brings me to authorial intent. So we always say when you're writing fiction, it's guidelines, not rules, right? We have guidelines for what you should or shouldn't do, but they are not hard and fast rules. So you can do basically anything that you want in fiction. I always tell people this when they come to me with like some crazy idea. If you want to write a story about a sentient hot dog, yes, you can do that. But go for it. But there's two things that you need to do. You need to do it well, and you need to do it with intent. So why is this the story you want to write? If you're writing about a sentient hot dog, why? Why are you the person who should be telling this story? So if you're writing about rebellion, why? What's drawing you to that subject? So one of the things you want to consider is your theme. So what is a theme? It's an idea that recurs in or pervades a piece of art. So oftentimes people think of theme as a message that you are conveying to the reader, and it can be that. It can also be a question that you are considering and you are trying to explore through the use of your fiction. Another thing you'll want to think about is character arc. So if you have a rebellion, does that reinforce your character's arc? Now, I know when I talk to writers, there is a lot of question over that dividing line between YA and adult. Like, people often ask me, is this YA, is this adult? And I feel like sometimes we get a lot of rebellion in YA, specifically because it reinforces the character's growth. Oftentimes we see teenagers rebelling against authority and finding themselves, and this is a very kind of YA theme, so we do see it often there. Another thing to think about is your plot framework. So a rebellion is not a framework. I know sometimes people get confused about this where I'm writing about a rebellion. That's not enough to hang a plot on, but it can provide the backdrop for your plot framework. When you think about the framework, it's going to be things like, is it a deadly competition? Is there a heist? Is there a MacGuffin that they are trying to chase? Is there a mission or a quest? And I'll talk a little bit more about how this weaves into the idea of rebellion. Okay, so when we look at writing things, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, is what they always say. So I also think the best predictor of fictional behavior is also past behavior. So when you're writing a rebellion, you do want to look to history and you do want to look to the past. So when you're looking at a rebellion, they do go through phases. So are you writing about the beginning of a rebellion, the middle of one, or the end, or more than one of those things? So this is a loose outline of a revolution as based on case studies of American, French, and Russian revolutions. So this is off of the Anatomy of a Revolution. This is a book by Crane Brinton, who studied these revolutions and tried to pull out the commonalities between them. So does everything follow this mold? No, but it's a good framework to work from. So first off, there's the preliminary stage in a revolution where the government is economically and politically weak. We see class antagonism. Often there's a big gap between the classes that causes that. There's some sort of sense of injustice. So do the people feel they have a say in their governing, or perhaps do they have complaints about taxation? After that is the first stage, which is the rise of the moderates. So moderate leaders will initially take control, but they face challenges from both the old regime and radicals. So they're trying to reform rather than destroy existing structures. But because of that, they tend to compromise and they cannot fully satisfy those calls for change. So generally under this stage, there's going to be increasing protests, financial breakdown. There may be some violence as a result, but the government's not able to fully suppress the radicals. The radicals at this stage are better organized, they're better staffed, they're better obeyed because there's a fanatical devotion to that cause. The third stage is the crisis stage. And this is where I feel like a lot of people will write about a revolution. This is where the radicals take control, there's an increase of violence, there may be war. There's a centralization of power where the power is concentrated in a small group or in an individual. And radical reign is often one of terror and virtue, according to Crane Brinton. So there's an increase in summary executions. So if you look at the French Revolution, I think we all know about the guillotine. And there's an obsession with the suppression of vices. And the last and fourth stage is the recovery stage. So this is a slow and uneven return to quieter times. There's a restoration of many of the pre-revolution ways, and there is a reaction against the Puritanism of the revolution. So this is basically, at this point, they're rebuilding the government, but with small changes from before. So Brinton actually concluded that the lasting results of revolutions were disappointing, and they didn't bring about lasting social change. But you don't have to agree with that when you are writing your story. You could potentially deviate from this outline, because we call it speculative fiction for a reason. We are speculating on what might happen or what might be different from what we see. There's often more than one stage covered in somebody's writing, sometimes all of them, especially if you're writing a series, even if not all of these stages are given equal weight. Okay, so the other thing I have to talk about is we do see rebellion under the context of revolution. We often also see it under the context of decolonization, especially historically. So this is going to be slightly different from revolution, which is a process that's occurring within a country, and decolonization is something that takes place between two countries. So the process of colonization does take place before this. I'm just going to go over that briefly. It's a country taking over another for its resources and land. Oftentimes they're ostensibly there to help this other country by spreading, quote unquote, a better culture, which means they are oppressing the indigenous one, which removes and reduces any sense of unity. They will often destroy physical representations of symbols from the indigenous culture, and they reduce them to second-class status in their own land. And finally, they can transform and exploit the aspects of indigenous culture that don't die off. So, what do you do after that? There is a process of decolonization. So this is from an article by Pokolenui, who is looking at this in relation to Hawaii. And I would highly recommend this article. It's so interesting, and it goes much more in depth than I'm going to go. So the first step in this process of decolonization is a process of rediscovery and recovery. So those suffering the consequences of colonialism, they start questioning whether their culture is actually inferior, as it is assumed to be. There's a recovery and rediscovery of indigenous history, as well as understanding what actually happened under colonization. And then lost aspects of culture such as language and traditions, because oftentimes those are subsumed during the process of colonization. And this forms the basis for the next steps. So the next step is mourning. So this naturally follows. So this is a time when people are able to lament their victimization. It can also increase and accelerate rediscovery, because sometimes people who are mourning what they're lost can immerse themselves in that past history. And so these stages can kind of feed on one another. This can also be expressed in anger against the colonizer. Sometimes people get stuck in this phase and they never move past it. And if you read this article, it talks more about how and why that can happen. And the third phase is going to be dreaming. And this is obviously so important. So this is about exploring future possibilities through debate, consultation, and building dreams. So what is going to be the new social order after we decolonize? This is about reassessing current structures and expanding worldviews. It's more than just putting previously colonized people into positions held by colonizers. It's an all-encompassing reevaluation, and it needs time to run its full course. The fourth stage is commitment. So that's committing to the dreams and making the decision to make them a reality. So at this point, there should be consensus on the issues to commit to and what direction society should be moving in. And the fifth and final stage is action. And this is, again, one that is commonly seen in fiction. So action does sometimes happen between these phases, but unsuccessfully and as a reaction to attack. This fifth step is proactive and taken upon consensus. So this could be a call to reason on one side, and on the other, a call to arms. So it's not necessarily always going to break out in violence. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about the historical context, if you're writing rebellion, one of the things you want to think about is, does your rebellion succeed? So, when we look at fictional examples, most oftentimes the rebellion does succeed. Even when it does succeed, there's generally a lot of back and forth. We see suffering of defeats in battles or otherwise. That just happens a lot in fiction. If you've ever heard about try and fail cycles, I feel like a rebellion mirrors that really well. But what if you're writing a true defeat? Consider what you're trying to say and what your intent is as an author. So ask yourself, does your story intend to uphold status quo, or is it encouraging a changing of it? Is the rebellion a force for the protagonist or a force against them? So I feel like a great example of upholding status quo is the Marvel superhero universe, if any of you are into that. I used to watch everything that they put out, and I got to Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and I found it to be really frustrating in this respect. So the rebels on this show, they're the antagonists, even if they sort of have a point. So they're really upset because with the blip, that's like Thanos taking away 50% of all living things, they kind of found like a better way to live. And when all of those people were returned, the governments didn't really deal with that well or fairly. They left people stateless and without the same rights that they once had. So I'm like, yes, of course they would be upset. Yet, instead of engaging in societal change, the Falcon and the Winter Soldier, they defeat the rebels and then they tell the world at large to do better, which oversimplifies everything, and it just ends up maintaining the status quo. So I feel like they could have said a lot more interesting things here, but they kind of retreated to that status quo. So if you're writing a rebellion and it fails, why exactly did it fail? There are a number of reasons that a rebellion can fail. It could just be not powerful enough. The oppressive regime could just have many more resources, many more people. There could be too much internal division. or betrayal. A betrayal could happen. Logistics, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. They could be acting too early. Maybe they're not organized completely, or they haven't come to a consensus, or they just may not have clear plans for the future or what comes after. So has anyone here read The Traitor Baru Cormorant by Seth Dickinson? No? Okay, I'm gonna avoid spoilers. But Baru's entire goal, like she comes from a colonized nation, and her entire goal is to take down the empire from within. So she's trying to rise within the ranks and to free her homeland. And through the course of the story, she becomes involved with a rebellion. Does that rebellion succeed? You'll have to read to find out. But I feel like this book says really interesting things about how someone trying to work within the system can become corrupted by it and also complicit in its atrocities. So again, you want to consider what you're trying to say when you're writing a rebellion. And it also speaks really well to the mindset of the colonized people, where there's this self-repression in order to become acceptable by the empire. And the outcome of the rebellion here is inextricably tied to the themes of the book. And it wouldn't have been as impactful had it ended any other way. Okay. In those slides about revolution and decolonization, there are times during upheaval where people don't agree. So I know we say often the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but sometimes the enemy of my enemy is not always my friend. So in revolutions, when we talked about revolutions, there are moderates, there are radicals. In decolonization, they do need consensus before action. So even if people agree on who their enemy is, they can be divided by the methods they want to employ and what they want the eventual outcome to be. So do we want to call for peace, or do we want to call to arms? And if we topple the oppressive regime, what do we replace it with? What do we want the future to look like? This may seem less important in the face of oppression and getting rid of a regime first, but these things can cause factions to become diametrically opposed. It's important to understand the ways that factions and what you're writing agree and disagree. Can they find common ground? And not just that, but enough common ground to work together. Do loyalties and goals in the factions shift throughout the book? So I'm going to go over a couple of examples. I don't know if any of you have read or not, but there's a book called The Final Strife by Sarah El Arifi. In this book, people are divided by blood color. So there's already been a failed rebellion in the past. They tried to rebel, didn't work out. The information that the people have about the past and about the empire is also divided, sometimes along these bloodlines. So as the people work together and against one another throughout this book, and they exchange information, things begin to change. So this is a really interesting example of the way that loyalties and goals can shift, which drives some factions together and some apart through the course of the story. Another great example of factions within a rebellion is Forged by Blood by Ehigbor Okasan. In this one, the current regime is oppressing magic users, and among the magic users, there's two separate factions who disagree about how the oppressive regime should end. So one believes it should end through violence, and the other through peaceful means. This has a huge effect on the outcome of the story, and the climax as both groups move toward overthrowing the oppressive regime and also vie for power against one another. Okay, this I feel like is so important if you're writing a rebellion. The role of propaganda. So if you're writing a rebellion, it becomes a story within a story. So what is propaganda? It's information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote a particular cause, doctrine, or point of view. So another important thing to note is that propaganda is not always the tool of the oppressive regime alone. It can be used by either side and often has an emotional appeal. So, have you ever gone on the internet and seen somebody's terrible take? I'm sure we all have. It's happened to everybody. And then annoyed, you go on there and you like lay out the facts. You're like, no, this is not true. I've read this study. This is what actually happened. Has that ever worked? Not usually. Do they back down? Probably not. Sometimes they'll just call you names or block you. So how often do you think you change someone's mind by spouting a bunch of facts at them? Probably not that often. So this is where propaganda comes in, because it's making an emotional appeal and is more likely to move people's hearts and minds. So propaganda can be a number of different things. So it could be catchy slogans that get repeated. It could be things like testimonials from authority figures that people are more likely to believe. So if someone that most people trust says a thing, then we feel like it must be true. It can be a form of entertainment. So stories often capture emotion and imagination. They can often also be used as propaganda. There's demonizing and scapegoating, which happens a lot in an oppressive regime. So people really, really like a simple solution to their problems. We always have problems in a society, but it's so much more appealing to be told, hey, this one group over here, they're the ones to blame for what's going on right now, the things that you don't like. But it's much harder to acknowledge that the root of the problem is complicated, and thus the solution is complicated. It's not very catchy to go and tell people that the solution here is going to be a multi-step process. People don't attach to that very easily. So propaganda is going to influence opinions, it's going to shape perception, it mobilizes people to action, and it can be used to demoralize opponents. So it's a very powerful tool in rebellions. So you want to look at how is that propaganda distributed, how are they reinforcing that propaganda, and what is the gap between the propaganda and reality? Is it quite small? Is it just an interpretation? Or are they telling outright lies? So The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, who's amazing, I will always sing her praises. This is a really, really great use of propaganda in an oppressive regime, and also in use by the rebellion. So I don't often see this in YA because I feel like YA oftentimes deals less in political matters, but it does this to very, very great effect. So in the Hunger Games, the Capitol uses the games themselves, and this is meant to remind districts of their place. It's used to cultivate fear and control, and to distract its citizens, because look, we're just watching people on a big shiny screen, and that's distracting from the actual problems that are going on. For the rebellion, the Mockingjay becomes branded as a symbol of the resistance, and that helps to create a unified identity for the resistance. There are also videos put out by the Capitol to twist the events that happen. For example, there's a point at which PETA is captured, and he's used to speak out against Katniss. And on the other side, PETA again, at one point he lies about Katniss being pregnant before they go into the games in order to provoke general outrage from people. It's all propaganda. And even fashion can be used as propaganda. So we see Katniss in here being dressed up very beautifully in this elaborate dress that gets set on fire, and she becomes branded as the girl on fire and becomes a symbol of the rebellion, even if she's a rather reluctant symbol. Oh. Sorry, hold on. Technical difficulties. Okay. All right, so very important part of rebellions. What is the role of violence? So I want to just tell you a quick anecdote about a panel I did once. It was an online panel, and Evan Winters was moderating, and if you're familiar with him, he wrote The Rage of Dragons and its follow-up. He's a brilliant writer, very, very thoughtful. So there were a number of other epic fantasy authors on this panel with me, and at one point, he asked us straight up, do your books glorify violence? And then he said, Andrea, you answer first. And we had not gotten the questions beforehand. So I had no idea this question was going to be asked. And I sat there like sweating, like not knowing what the words were that were coming out of my mouth, because I was like, does my book glorify violence? I'm really not sure. I hadn't thought about it. So this is something that you'll want to consider when you are writing your own books about rebellion. Does it glorify violence? I don't know. As a writer, I'm often reminded of that saying of Sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. However, I feel like as a writer, I disagree with that. I feel like there's a very large importance of words and stories, and they can hurt people, they can help people. So I don't think it's just sticks and stones. So consider carefully the role of violence in your books. How much are you showing? What are you showing? And what is your intention in doing so? So are you intending to shock your reader? Are you intending to disgust them? Or are you indeed glorifying violence and you're writing this as a call to arms? So violence is often present in rebellions and can often be parsed out into reactive violence and proactive violence. So oppressive regimes will often use violence as a tool, and those being repressed can respond with reactive violence. Violence can be deliberate, it can be intentionally meant to inflict pain and humiliation and to exert more control. It can also be incidental, so there may be a powder keg of factors that could erupt at any moment, and that just happens to erupt in violence. All of these things are interrelated, and violence can be linked not just with control, but with propaganda. Again, such an important part. Because propaganda can be used to dehumanize others and to invoke fear, which makes violence a lot more likely. So a great example of the use of violence is The Unbroken by C.L. Clarke. So if any of you have read this, it is this very unflinching and complex view of decolonization and rebellion. The main character was stolen from her homeland when she was just a child, and she was raised in the colonizing country to be part of their army, and then sent back to her homeland to help to suppress a rebellion. So you can imagine the stuff that this character goes through. So she has so many conflicting loyalties, and C.L. Clarke does such a good job of not shying away from the difficulties here. She enters into a toxic relationship with the woman in charge from the colonizing country. She has friendships and camaraderie with her fellow soldiers who are also stolen children. At the same time, she's engaging on an individual level with decolonization because she's returned to her homeland. She's rediscovering and mourning her past. She sees her mother, who she's not seen in so many years and who she now disagrees with. So when violence inevitably erupts in this book, Clarke uses it very surgically, with her main character forced to decide what violence she should enact and who exactly she is enacting it upon. Okay. Another important thing to consider, who's the boss? Who's in charge here? It's important to consider who is leading this rebellion, and depending on your intentions and the themes that you're exploring, this can go a number of different ways. So does it begin with a single upstart? Is there a group that is starting this rebellion? Is the person who is starting the rebellion, are they coming from a place of power? Are they somebody that's high up in the government? Are they rich? Or are they part of a disenfranchised working class? That's going to change the nature of your rebellion and what happens with it. Sometimes there's a puppet master who's working from behind the scenes. That happens too. Consider the role of charisma, rhetoric, and intelligence. What does your leader have, and is there anything that they lack? How does that influence the path of the rebellion? So there's a couple of really great examples I want to go over here. So there is Grace of Kings by Ken Liu, which is a fantastic rendition of a rebellion and empire and what happens after. So in Grace of Kings, there are two leaders who actually combine forces to overthrow the empire, and they're very different. So one of them is this charming bandit, and then the other is a stoic warrior. So while they do team up to overthrow the empire, they end up having opposing ideas on what things should look like in the aftermath, and that they haven't really fully engaged with this. One thinks they should have a more democratic process after they overthrow the empire, and the other one wants a return to aristocracy, which ultimately leads to a lot of conflict between them. Dune by Frank Herbert, I'm sure like most of you have either read it or seen the movie. This is a very classic example. here's this leader who's someone who's essentially there through manipulation. If you're familiar with the story, the Bene Gesserit have like seeded all the stories of this Messiah who's going to come and free the Fremen. Is Paul there to free the Fremen? Sure. But does he have ulterior motives, and is his leadership the result of generations of manipulation of the native population? Also yes. So there's a very specific reason for this, and I have to always come back to authorial intent, because his whole intent here was to deconstruct that hero narrative and to caution against blind devotion to messianic figures. So Paul may be a hero to the Fremen in this book, but his actions also lead to devastating outcomes for the galaxy at large. Okay, what are our plans? How do we take down the opposition? Does your rebellion have a plan to take down the regime? If they're facing certain disadvantages, if they have a lack of money, too few people, not enough consensus, etc., how do they plan to overcome them? Do they plan to erode the regime's advantages, add to their own, or both? Do those plans work? If not, do they have backup plans, and how adaptable is your resistance? So this is often where a plot framework can come in. And a really great example of this is Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. So the plot framework for this book is actually a heist. There's a group of criminals who are planning on destabilizing the nobility by starting a house war between them. And then they want to enact this heist to steal the wealth of the ruler. And in that case, they are removing the advantages of the oppressive regime and adding to their own advantages, because then they will have the money. So what are the main things that your resistance must accomplish in order to overthrow the current regime? So unfortunately, and this is the thing about being an author, having your characters plan a rebellion means that you too have to plan a rebellion. So it had better be a good plan, or your readers won't believe you. And this is one of those saving graces of being an author too, is generally you have a lot more time to figure this out, and you have a lot more space than maybe your characters do. So you can have your characters appear very smart and very clever, while you yourself have been taking months to figure out what exactly they're going to be doing. So, do they want to obtain weapons? Do they want to obtain money? Are they trying to gain the support of a key group? These are the things that can help you figure out what the framework of your plot is going to be. Okay, so now I just realized I skipped over a slide when I was, okay, this is the slide. So I'm going back to this one. Okay, so another thing that you'll want to think about when you are writing rebellions is resources. So I did study economics at school, and this is where that can come in handy, because rebellions aren't just about moral imperative or who has the most people on their side, though we may be tempted to focus on this or choose to focus on this. Again, think about what your authorial intent is. Sometimes they're spurred on over resources. So in colonization, there's often an extraction of resources, or sometimes they restrict resources as part of oppression or control. So you want to ask yourself, who has access to what resources? They may say that a rebellion is built on hope, but you cannot run a rebellion on hopes and dreams alone. So we have to think about the practicalities. So a rebellion needs things like money, so they need to fund their tools of rebellion, or sometimes they can purchase support, they can purchase mercenaries, things like that. Food, you have to feed the rebels for as long as you have your rebellion going. And weapons, so if there is violence taking place in your rebellion, you are going to need to arm those rebels. So consider how your rebellion is gaining access to these necessary resources. Do they have access to someone in power who can provide them with money? I know this is like a key point in Andor, where one of the senators was funneling money to the rebels and trying to hide that. Are they planning on stealing any of these resources? Are they going to bargain or blackmail for them? Or are they going to seize them by force? So a great example of this is Terry Pratchett's Night Watch. So every time I go and I read Terry Pratchett, I'm always reminded of how generous with humanity he is and just how brilliant of a writer he is. So this one involves a really interesting setup, and it has time travel, it has a serial killer, and it has a revolution, and somehow he manages to make all of those work together in a way that's actually quite funny as well. So in this story, the rebels seize the docks, they seize the warehouse, and they seize the food terminals. So they actually at that point control all the resources needed to support the rest of the city, which becomes a very important point in the plot. Okay, now I will go back to where we were before. Okay. All right, so the last thing to consider after your rebellion, what does it look like to put the world back together after all of this conflict? So what are your characters' hopes and dreams? Before the order was overthrown, did your rebellion come to a consensus? Is there a gap between the dreams the rebellion has put forth and what they're able to accomplish? Okay, I know this is a very, very common complaint about politicians who promise the world and then get into office and find that it's much more complicated than they first thought it would be. So in those case studies of revolution, there is an eventual return to something like the old system, but with minor changes. Again, you can interrogate that. If you don't agree that that is the way that a revolution does or always should end, you can change that. And with decolonization, that involves establishing independence from the colonizer. But what does that look like? Because there's probably been years and years of colonization and everything is kind of set into a certain system. Even if you end with the rebellion victorious and with a new order in place, it can be good to leave some loose threads that readers can pick up at the end and to leave them with a sense of what new adventures and challenges your characters are going to face, because I feel like readers like to feel that the story continues off the page. You want to conclude the main conflict, but some little threads is fine. And I think a really great example of this is Shannon Chakraborty's City of Brass and the follow-ups. So we spend 3 books of rebellion in here, and finally, at last, the ruler is overthrown and we get a council put in place. But in the last chapters of the book, we see the members of this council arguing over what the future should look like. And I feel like it does such a good job of showing the messiness of a rebellion's resolution, how that's not the end. It's not a happily ever after. Even with consensus, there can be disagreement over the finer points, and perhaps there should be, because without dialogue, how do we move forward in a way that's satisfying for everyone? So I want to leave you with this thought. So in Andor, if you've watched it, there's a very famous scene where Nemec is going over his manifesto about the unnatural state of empire, and he says, "The imperial need for control is so desperate because it is so unnatural." And I thought about that for a long time, and I was thinking, is it actually unnatural? So yes, under oppression, we see constant bids for freedom, but we also historically see oppression occurring over and over. And I think that people are just fearful creatures. We fear not getting enough, of what we have getting taken away. We are fearful of things we don't know and understand. And when we fear things, we seek to control the world around us, as if by doing so we can stop what we fear from occurring, and also control fear itself. And this need for control as an antidote to fear sometimes seeps into controlling other people. And this is where I think we get that oppressive regime. So maybe this is why rebellion is such an enduring motif, because perhaps it's not freedom or oppression that are natural, but the cycle itself. That is cool.
Thank you for that extremely relevant presentation. We'd like to have time for questions about rebellion in literature or anything else that you might want to ask, Andrea. So just, it's helpful for the recording if I bring this to you. Who wants to break the ice? Thoughts, questions?
No, nothing.
Well, Justin will break the ice. That's good. He's a ringer. Superman shirt's a giveaway.
Christopher Reeves was on this morning, so I had to present accordingly.
Why did you choose to stop at the Falcon and the Winter Soldier?
Because I did find this return to status quo really frustrating, because we see oftentimes big changes taking place within each movie or each television show, and those things don't get carried throughout to the rest of the universe. They get kind of like left behind and forgotten about. And while I found each individual movie and show entertaining, I found that overall it was starting to leave me feeling like kind of empty and kind of irritated. So that's where I stopped. Maybe I'll pick it up again someday, but I think it'd have to be a really compelling reason too.
All right. Anyone else? Okay, great. Hold on a second.
Thank you. You talked a lot about, you mentioned a lot of different books as examples of different authors exploring different elements of rebellion. I'm wondering, you mentioned some articles that looked at case examples of rebellions and revolutions and decolonization. I'm wondering if in your own writing you were looking to specific historical examples to kind of either as examples or as starting places to then take things in a new direction, or something along those lines.
I don't think I was looking at specific examples, but more overall, what do we see occurring over and over again? Because we do see a lot of common elements in oppressive regimes and also in revolution. Like, one of the most interesting things that I think that I've seen is when Andor was coming out, and people were looking at it and they're like, this is obviously referencing Palestine, right? But what they were actually referencing was the French Revolution. So the fact that these things occur so often means that, like, you can be referencing a specific example and people will think that you're referencing something else. And that's like, so to me, I'm like, I'm just gonna look at the general examples and like the similarities that I see between them. And obviously I have to change things because there's magic in this world. There are creatures that don't exist in our world. So I just have to make those adjustments based on that. But human behavior, I feel like overall as a group, we do repeat the same patterns over and over.
Anyone else? Good. Oh, okay, excellent. Sorry. Here you go.
Thank you. This is kind of a logistics question, but when you're talking about world building and writing something that might span like multiple books even, do you start thinking that from the beginning and sort of plan out the big major arc and then separate it? Or are you thinking kind of focus on the first one and then it builds naturally? Like, how does your process look for that?
As far as logistics go?
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like it depends on how much of an issue it's going to be in the books. If it is a key issue, then obviously I have to plan that in from the beginning because it's something that's going to be affecting everything else. Oftentimes there are matters of logistics that are maybe not quite as plot relevant that can be built in later. Again, I feel like this is a lot about like, what are you focusing on when you're writing a rebellion? Are you focusing on a rebellion that has a key point of like maybe obtaining some special weapon? In that case, you need to build that in. Like, where is that coming from? And who has it? And is it something that is built? Then maybe you have to consider what resources were used to build it. So I feel like in all cases of world building, it's kind of this back and forth process. I know that there are some people that will build an entire world before they start writing their plot. We can't all be Tolkien, but I feel like for most people, it's like a back and forth process where you build a little bit of your world, it affects your plot, and then you think about your plot, and that tells you some more things about your world. So for me, it's generally like that.
Which also ties into a workshop you're doing this afternoon, right? Finding
yes,
character.
I'm talking about how to build character and world at the same time.
Yeah, that's at 1 o'clock in the collab. Who else did I miss in terms of hands? Yes. Is it Monica? Okay. I have to name.
I'm not sure how relevant this is, but Ursula Le Guin, she talked about why she picked her characters to be male. And that's been too long ago to actually name. But your characters are you have a lot of female characters. So did you get any pushback, or were you supported, or how did that, is that kind of just organically who you are? You didn't have to think about it? Was it a consideration? All those things.
I didn't think about it for my first series, but part of it is that in my first series, it's a very egalitarian world. I mean, there are a lot of problems. But in the sense of like between genders, there's not really any kind of gap. Anybody can be, like any man, woman, other can be anything in that world. So it didn't really matter to me who was going to be male or female when I was starting out writing it. I mean, I knew that I wanted to have two women in a queer relationship, and I knew that I wanted to have them dealing with class differences, but I didn't necessarily want them to be dealing with like issues of like, we are queer and this is like a problem, because in that world that I built, it's not an issue. And I wanted it to be the same with like gender equality. A lot of inequality in other places, but not there.
Good. Yes, Al. Best way to get to you. Oh, you're fine. You're fine. I'm just slow.
With us seeing a lot of oppressive regimes, rebellion happening in today's world, what, in your opinion, is the importance of rebellion in fiction and the types of books that you write?
I do think that it can kind of shine a mirror on what is happening today. I don't think that you can really, I think it's very hard actually to write something that is not political, because anytime that you're writing something and you want it to be realistic and you want it to be reflective of human experience, you have to look to history, you have to look to current events, because this is the way that people are and this is the way that people behave. So what you write is just gonna naturally be political. Even like trying to exclude things that we see as political today is in itself a political act. I do think a lot about current events, and a lot of the times when I write, I am trying to explore how do we get through a period of time like this in a way that maybe minimizes violence, or in a way that we end up with a better outcome. And that's the way that I like to treat theme, as a question and as a way to explore what is happening now, to give myself some comfort maybe.
Good. Anyone else? This has been good. Yes. You just did that to make me run over here.
So I've noticed in your presentation there is an implicit empathy toward the rebels, and I think that makes perfect sense. And first of all, young adult fiction is a big part of fantasy, and every young adult's a rebel. And America views itself as a rebel, rebel without a cause. What are you rebelling against? What do you got? But since by definition a rebellion is anything going against the status quo, have you ever been interested in writing a story in which the rebels are not sympathetic?
I haven't myself been interested in that, because I think that changing the status quo is more interesting in a lot of ways. However, I have seen it addressed in really interesting ways. I'm actually reading a book right now called The Revenant of Sorolophia, which actually everybody's kind of got these very distinct gray areas, including the rebels, and you don't necessarily want them to succeed. But I have not myself explored that yet, no.
Okay. Anyone else? Are you sure? I see people sort of look like they're thinking about it. No? Okay, well, thank you so much. Really, it's been an honor to have you here.